shadow that wears our skin. There are some silences that are not peaceful. They are heavy, coiled, waiting for a breath to break them. The silence in my grandmother's house in Kampong Tom was like that. It was a physical thing, a weight in the air so thick you could taste it. It tasted of dust, of the ghosts of yesterday's incense, and the sickly sweet perfume of overripe mangoes rotting in the heat. My name is Likina. I was a student at the university in Phnom Penh then, a city girl accustomed to the constant roar of motos and the chatter of a million lives lived on top of one another. I had come back to my grandparents' village for Pichum Ben, the festival of the dead, a time to honor the ancestors. I thought the quiet of the countryside would be a relief. I was wrong. Their house stood on tall stilts, a dark island of teakwood in a sea of green rice paddies. During the day, the cicadas screamed, a sound so constant it became its own kind of silence. But at night, a deeper quiet fell, a listening quiet. In the center of the main room, commanding the entire space, was the Esbek Tom. It was my grandfather's great pride, a huge screen of taut, white silk framed in intricately carved wood. In front of it, leaning against the frame, were the puppets. They weren't the little hand puppets you might imagine. They were enormous, magnificent figures cut from single pieces of cowhide, their forms and faces perforated with 1,000 tiny holes to let the light through. Pre-Reem, the hero. Ning Seta, his beautiful wife. Krong Reap, the 10-headed demon king, and Hanuman, the loyal monkey general. They were characters from the Reemker, our great epic, frozen in a timeless battle between good and evil. My Lokta, my grandfather, had been a master puppeteer in his youth, his hands making the gods and demons dance in the firelight. But his hands were gnarled with age now, his eyes clouded with cataracts. The puppets hadn't danced in years. They were just relics, a silent audience to our small lives. The first night I was kept awake by the humidity, a film of moisture that clung to my skin, my clothes, the bedsheets, and by a sound, a faint, dry scratching. I told myself it was a gecko scrambling across the thatched roof, or maybe termites in the old wood. The house was old, full of little noises. I turned over, pulling the thin cotton sheet over my head, and tried to ignore the cloying smell of mangoes that seemed to seep in from the very walls of the house. It was strongest right there, in the main room, near the silent theater of the Esbek Tom. The next morning, I helped my grandmother, prepare the rice offerings for the monks at the pagoda. Her hands, small and wrinkled, moved with a certainty that came from a lifetime of ritual. As I sat at the low wooden table, my eyes drifted to the Esbek Tom. Something was wrong. Hanuman, the monkey god, was always posed in a triumphant leap, his leg kicked high, his mace ready to strike. But now he was different. His leather leg was lowered, his body slumped. His head, usually held high in defiance, was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if his neck had been snapped. The intricate holes that made up his eyes now seemed to express not courage, but a kind of deep, unending agony. I frowned. Yi, did Lokta move the puppets? She glanced over, her eyes barely registering them. No, Aun, why would he? His hands are too weak. Hanuman, I said, pointing, he's fallen. She squinted, then gave a dismissive wave of her hand. The house shifts, Likina. The leather is old and heavy. It settles. Don't worry about old things. She went back to packing the sticky rice into banana leaves, her lips moving in a silent prayer. But I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep-seated anxiety she was trying to bury under the mundane tasks of the morning. I tried to listen to her. I tried to believe it was just an old house and old leather. But the feeling of being watched, of that heavy, listening silence, it didn't go away. It grew. The next day it was Ning Seta. The puppet of the beautiful princess, usually the picture of grace, was now cowering. Her delicate leather arm was thrown across her face, a gesture of pure terror, and looming over her was Krong Reap, the demon king. But his face was the thing that made my blood run cold. The artists who carved these figures give the demons monstrous, inhuman faces, but this face was different. The 10-headed crown was the same, but the main face. The sneer on its lips, the cruel downward slant of the eyes. It was the exact expression of a man from the village, a man named Tom Mock, who had tried to steal a portion of my grandfather's land a few years back. He had died suddenly, a fever that took him in less than a day. "Look," I whispered to my grandfather, who was sitting in his rattan chair, staring out at the rain. "Lokta, look at Krong Reap. Doesn't he look like?" My grandfather turned his head slowly, his cloudy eyes fixing on the screen. For a long moment he said nothing. The only sound was the drumming of the rain on the roof. Then his voice was a low rasp. "You see too much. Your city eyes are not used to the shadows here. Leave it be." He turned away, a tremor in his hand that had not been there a moment before. That night the scratching sound was louder. It wasn't the sound of insects anymore. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a dry, insect-like scratching of painted hide on taut fabric. It was the sound of a story being rewritten, and I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that the puppets were moving in the dark. I had to know. I couldn't sleep in this house, couldn't breathe this sweet, cloying air for one more night without knowing if I was losing my mind. I took out my smartphone, the battery nearly dead from the inconsistent village electricity. I propped it up on a stack of books, aimed it at the Esbeck Tom, and hit record. Then I retreated to my small room, shut the thin wooden door, and waited for the morning, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I barely slept. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the wall, I crept out. The house was still. My grandparents were already awake, their quiet movements a familiar morning ritual. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and hurried back to my room, pulling the mosquito net around me like a shroud. I scrolled through the video file. For the first few hours, it was just a static, grainy image of the screen in the moonlight. Nothing. I started to feel foolish. Maybe my grandmother was right. Old house, old leather. Then, at the timestamp 3:17 a.m., it happened. It started with a twitch. The hand of Krong Reap, the demon, slowly, impossibly, curled into a fist. The movement was stiff, ancient, accompanied by a faint creak of dry leather. Then, with a slowness that was more terrifying than any sudden motion, the figures began to shift. They didn't jump or fly. They writhed. They slid against the silk screen, their painted bodies rearranging themselves. The scratching sound I'd been hearing now perfectly audible on the phone's microphone. It was no longer the epic of the Reemker. It was a grotesque pantomime. The demon Krong Reap no longer loomed over the princess. It had turned its back on her, and next to him the puppet of a wise old hermit, a rishi, had changed. He was no longer standing tall in meditation. He was bent, his back curved in a familiar, weary stoop, the stoop of my grandfather. And the princess, Ningseta, was no longer cowering in fear. She was on her knees, her hands clasped together, not in prayer but in a desperate plea. Her head was bowed, and the light from the phone's screen caught the intricate carvings of her face. It was the face of my grandmother, etched in leather and despair. I felt the air leave my lungs, but the worst was yet to come. A smaller figure, one of the minor courtier puppets that usually stood in the background, began to move. It slid from the edge of the screen towards the center, towards the twisted effigies of my grandparents. It was a simple figure, its features less defined than the main characters. As it moved into the moonlight, I saw its posture. Head tilted down, looking at a phone in its hands. Me. It was me. And then I saw the other thing. The thing the video revealed that my eyes couldn't see in the dark room. Behind the screen, where the puppeteer should be, a new shadow stretched. It wasn't cast by any of the puppets. It was cast by something behind them, something in the 3 feet of space between the silk and the wall. It was long, disjointed. Its arms were thin like bamboo poles, its fingers like bundles of twigs. And they were twitching, dancing in the air, mimicking the motions of a master puppeteer, but without rods, without strings, without any human touch at all. It was guiding them, posing them, arranging them into this silent, horrifying tableau of my family's doom. I dropped the phone on the mattress. The images were burned into my mind. The stooped grandfather, the pleading grandmother, the oblivious child. and the shadow master conducting its silent opera of despair. I had to understand, this wasn't a haunting, this was a curse, a ritual. I found my grandmother in the kitchen, fanning the coals of a small clay stove. I didn't know how to ask. I just started talking, my voice trembling. "Yi, you have to tell me about the Esbeck Tom. Where did it come from, please?" She stopped fanning, her face becoming a closed, stubborn mask. "It is just an old thing, Aun, from before. It is nothing." "It's not nothing," I insisted, my voice rising with panic. "The puppets, they move, they look like us, and there's something behind the screen." She flinched at my words, a deep primal fear entering her eyes. She looked around the small kitchen as if the walls themselves were listening. She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Do not speak of it," she hissed, her voice a dry whisper. "Do not give it a name, do not give it your attention. It is a Kamak Ta Dip, an old spirit, a spirit of the earth bound to this land. It was here before the house, before the village. It feeds on stories, it starves without them. Do not give it yours." Her words chilled me more than the video. A Kamak Ta Dip, a raw, ancient spirit, not the ghost of a person but something more elemental. My grandfather refused to speak of it at all. When I tried to ask him, his face, usually so gentle, became hard as stone. He slammed his fist on the table, a sound that cracked the silence of the house. "Enough! You bring your city foolishness into my home. There are things you do not touch." I knew I wouldn't get answers from them. They were too afraid. They had been living with this, I realized, for years, decades, living in the shadow of this thing, pretending it wasn't there. I started searching the house myself. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just had a desperate need to find a piece of the story that made sense. In a dusty wooden chest under my grandfather's bed, among his old puppetry tools, the mallets, the chisels, the pots of dried ink, I found it. It was a small, flat box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed silk, was a leather puppet. It was unfinished. The edges were rough, the details uncarved. But the shape. The shape was a young girl with long hair, her body thin and coltish. The figure of a child, my figure. There was no face carved into the leather. It was a terrifying blank. And pinned to its chest, tied with a single strand of black thread, was a tiny, faded lock of hair. My hair. It was from my first haircut, the one my grandmother had saved for good luck. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a story, it was a script. And the Kamak had already cast all the parts. This thing, this shadow, it wasn't just telling a story of our doom. It was writing it. The puppets were not just leather. They were vessels. Effigies tied to us by some terrible, unseen thread. The sweet smell of the mangoes, it was the scent of rot. The scent of something being ripened for the harvest. The incense my grandmother burned every day wasn't for the Buddha, not for our ancestors. It was an offering, an appeasement, an attempt to placate the starving author of our end. I walked back into the main room, the faceless puppet clutched in my hand. I held it out to my grandfather. His composure finally shattered. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a deep, hollow grief that seemed to age him another 20 years in an instant. The story, the one he had held inside for so long, came pouring out. He told me of the dark times under Pol Pot, the years of starvation, of fear. His family, his parents and younger siblings were wasting away. One day, desperate, he had wandered into the ruins of an old, bombed-out pagoda deep in the forest, and there, miraculously untouched, was the Esbeck Tom set. As he touched the cold leather, he heard a voice. Not a sound, he said, but a thought placed directly into his mind. It was a whisper from the shadows behind the screen. It promised him life. It promised him that his family would eat, that they would be safe, that they would prosper. It only asked for one thing in return. He had to become its puppeteer. He had to give it stories. He agreed. He thought it was a fever dream, a metaphor born of hunger. He brought the set to his village, and the miracles began. A wild deer, lost, wandered into their yard. A forgotten stash of rice was found under the floorboards of an abandoned house. His family survived. But the whisper returned. It was hungry again. It wanted a story, and it showed him how. It showed him how to see the faces of others in the leather. His first story was about a cruel Khmer Rouge cadre who had taken pleasure in tormenting the village. My grandfather, guided by the shadow's whispers, spent a week subtly recarving the face of a minor demon puppet. He added a scar over its eye, a twitch to its mouth. He offered it incense. A few days later, the cadre was found dead, bitten by a krite snake while he slept. Over the years, the cycle continued. Anyone who threatened his family, his land, his quiet life, their likeness would appear in the silent dance on the screen. A neighbor who stole his chickens, dead from a fall. A moneylender who charged too much interest, drowned in the floods. Each time, a small tragedy easily explained away. Each time, my grandfather told himself he was protecting his family. He was just the puppeteer, but he was feeding it. Life by life, story by story. Now he was old. He had no more enemies. He had no more stories to give. And the entity, the ancient Kamak Ta Dip, was starving, so it had decided to write its own final masterpiece, the story of the puppeteer who could no longer perform. That night the sky broke open. A monsoon storm raged, the wind screaming through the gaps in the wooden walls. The power, always unreliable, died instantly, plunging the house into a profound darkness broken only by strobing flashes of lightning. And with every flash, the espectrum was illuminated. The puppets were in their final poses. The grandfather on his knees, head bowed in submission. The grandmother weeping silently. And my figure, the faceless child, being pulled into the darkness by a twisted leather claw. The scratching sound was gone. It was replaced by a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of immense power held in check. Behind the screen, the shadow was no longer indistinct. In the flashes of lightning, I could see it, a cohesive, solid shape of darkness, its twig-like fingers gently caressing the back of the leather puppets. It was waiting for the story's end. My grandfather stood up, his body trembling but his eyes filled with a terrible resolve. He grabbed an old kerosene lamp from the wall and a faded krama from a hook. "It wants a story," he rasped, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. "I will give it one. It must burn. It is the only way to end the performance." He lit the krama, the makeshift torch flaring to life, casting our frantic shadows against the walls. He ran towards the screen, a guttural cry tearing from his throat, and thrust the flame against the white silk. The silk caught fire, but something was wrong. The flames licked at the leather puppets, but they wouldn't burn. The intricate carvings began to glow with a malevolent, dull red heat, as if they were being forged in a kiln. The leather darkened and hardened, the faces twisting into expressions of pure hatred. The hum rose in pitch, becoming a piercing shriek of rage, a sound that drilled into my skull. And the air, once sweet with mangoes, now reeked of burning hair and something else, something like cooking meat. The fire wasn't destroying the story, it was finishing it. The flames leaped from the screen to the dry wooden walls of the house. Smoke filled the room, hot and acrid. My grandfather, silhouetted against the inferno, turned to me, his face a mask of desperation. "Go, Likina, run. This is my debt to pay. I started this story." I was frozen, my feet rooted to the floor. My grandmother was staring, mesmerized at the glowing puppet of herself, its leather hands reaching out as if to welcome her into the fire. My grandfather grabbed me, his old strength surprising me, and shoved me bodily towards the stairs. "Live," he screamed. "Be the one who got away. That will be my last story for it." I tumbled down the wooden steps and out into the churning mud of the yard, the cold rain a shock against my skin. I scrambled to my feet and looked back at the house. It was an inferno, a roaring pyre against the black, stormy sky. And through the wall of flames I could still see it. The espectrum screen standing tall and perfectly, impossibly untouched. It was a gateway, a window into a hell of its own making. And as I watched, two new shadows flickered to life behind it. They stood on either side of the tall, disjointed form of the puppeteer. They were human-shaped, but twisted, elongated, their limbs moving with the same unnatural, jerking motions. The shadows of my grandparents. They had joined the cast. The master shadow, the original, slowly turned its head. It had no face, but I felt its gaze lock onto me across the muddy yard. I felt its attention, its hunger, its cold, ancient intelligence. And I knew, with a certainty that will haunt me until the day I die, that the story wasn't over. The performance was just missing its final character. I ran. I ran through the mud and the rain, and I didn't look back. I escaped the fire, but I never escaped the story. I live in the city now, surrounded by light and noise, but it doesn't help. Sometimes when I'm walking home late at night, I hear it. A faint, dry scratching sound like leather on silk just behind me. And when I look at my own shadow stretched out long under the orange streetlights, it seems longer than it should be. The fingers twitch and curl as if they are practicing, learning a new and terrible dance. So I am telling you this, a warning from a character who escaped the final act. Be careful of the old things that lie sleeping in the dark corners of the world. Be careful of the stories they want to tell, because some are not just told with words or with light. Some stories are written on a different kind of canvas. They are written in skin and in bone, and they are always hungry for a new ending.